So once again, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you and we thank you for taking time to be part of this crucial and important panel discussion where we will be discussing the positive impacts of climate change. Yes, climate change has been perennially affecting us and we are seeing the aftermath of climate change as the days go by. This is a clip from last Sunday's paper which actually showed us that Singapore is bearing a lot of after effects as the world warms up. Yes, the world is heating, climate is changing, everything around us is not the same. The main aim of this panel discussion this evening is to help discuss, find out, and come to a positive conclusion as to how we can go about this catastrophe. I'd like to begin by introducing our wonderful panel for this evening. We first have Dr. Shawn, who is with the Asian School of the Environment at the Nanyang Technological University and is also the president of the Nature Society in Singapore. Next, we have Professor Michael Maniates, who is with who teaches social sciences and environmental studies at Yale-NUS. Next, we have Ms. Jessica Cheam, who is the managing editor of Eco Business. She's an award-winning journalist, TV presenter, producer, and social entrepreneur. To the left of Ms. Cheam, we have Mr. Sandeep Rai, who is a senior advisor of Global Adaptation Policy with WWF International. And last but not the least, we have James Cook University's very own Dr. George Jacobs, who is an author of environmental education and humane education and also the president of the Vegetarian Society. Let's give them a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. So before we begin, I would like to tell you all about the format for this evening's panel discussion. Each panelist will be given 5 minutes to speak to us. At the end of 4 minutes, we will hear a bell, and there is a buffer time of 1 minute at the end of which we will hear another bell.
What does that bell sound like? Can you do a trial run? Will we hear it? Will we know it?
You will hear it. You will hear it. It's pleasant, I promise.
Yeah.
It's pleasant, I promise. So once our panelists are finished talking to us, we shall have a round of questions and answers. The first round of questions and answers will be amongst the panelists themselves, and next on we will open the floor for all of you to ask our panelists some questions. So this will be done using an online format, and I request you all to log on to slide.com and use the event code 3517. Slido.com, I'm sorry, Slido, S-L-I-D-O, Slido.com, and once you go there, event number 3517, you can post your questions directly. We shall showcase the questions on the screen and we shall proceed thereon. So without further ado, I would like to begin this evening's panel discussion.
Thank you very much. I spent a very important, personally, this means a lot to me too. I spent 1989 to 1990, a very wonderful year at James Cook University in Townsville in the Department of Botany, and it was a very formative experience for me. I learned a lot from my mentors, Dr. Betsy Jakes and so many others from the botany, zoology, and marine biology departments, and to be able to come back in a way to James Cook in this small way, it means a lot to me. I just wanted to say a few things. I'll focus on biodiversity and climate change, since that's a topic that I work with a little bit in my own work and in my activities. I just wanted to start out with, even without climate change, biodiversity is really faces an uphill battle to survive into even a few decades ahead. Here's some slides that were provided actually from WWF, and Dr. Rai. Look, this is the forest cover of Borneo, and I think if you look, when I was born in the 1960s, most of this vast island, world's third largest, was covered with rainforest. And then if you look at it today, most of the lowland forest is gone, mainly restricted to mountains that are very difficult to log. If you look at the island of Sumatra, it's even a little bit, it's even more depressing. There is the lowland forests in dark green, swamp forest on the east coast, and montane forest in olive. And if you look from, say, a century ago to maybe 30 years ago to today, you see that very little of this habitat, these amazing habitats home to Sumatran tiger, Sumatran elephant, Sumatran orangutan, just to name 3 iconic species, is really in trouble, and that's without the climate change. And I think with all these perturbations to the system, climate change on top of everything is a very worrying prospect indeed, and I think all of us will, on the panel, will be dwelling on these issues. Here's a paper published by staff from Autonomous University of Mexico and Stanford University, just looking at extinctions of vertebrates. And so if you look, the orange denote endangered, the percent endangered of these vertebrates, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and you can see that they range from maybe 40% for the birds all the way up to 70, 80% amphibians. And again, that's that adding climate change and many of the effects which we can't really predict right now. Well, we can predict it's bad, but here is extinction scenario, dark blue being the worst and yellow being the best, and it doesn't look very good. And James Cook University in Australia, and if you look at Australia there in the second column in the middle, it's a pretty bleak outlook. I'm just going to go through a few of these. Maybe I'll fast forward to the marine environment. This is This is specifically for ocean warming, produced last year by the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Just showing you coral bleaching. This is just one of many in Samoa over a 6-month period from December 2014 to August 2015. You can see these vast reefs with the increased temperature. The corals bleached and they didn't recover in this particular reef. Even more sobering. This is a report by Professor Terry Hughes. He was actually on the faculty at James Cook University. Now he's with the Australian Center for Excellence in Townsville in coral reef research. And if you look here, the red, the maps of the Cape York coast, I think Townsville is in that little dimple along the coast here of northeastern Queensland. Red denote, there's the bell. Now Prof. Maniates knows what it sounds like. Red is not good, and you can see with each bleaching event, it gets worse and worse. And this past bleaching event just last year, I think some of the northeastern Queensland reefs suffered over 90% bleaching, many of these. Prof. Terry Hughes, I heard him at a talk 8 years ago, and he was rather optimistic that corals might be able to adapt. Last year, he was saying this is the biggest tragedy he's ever seen, almost at a loss for words. That's all I have to say. In closing, I just wanted to say that on top of all the things that we're doing to the natural world, reducing its area, exploiting it, not using it sustainably, climate change comes along to really make it even more difficult. Species will they be able to adapt? Will they be able to migrate across this fragmented landscape? It looks very bleak, and so the question I have is, how is it possible for us to have a positive outlook on biodiversity and climate change? Hopefully by the end of the session we will have. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn, for piloting the bell. Now I know what it sounds like. We hadn't planned our talks, and at least we hadn't talked with one another about our talks, but I think I'll be picking up on some things that Shawn has said, around this notion of tragedy. So I'm Michael. I have been at Yale and US for the last 4.5 years working in the environmental studies program. Much of my work sort of revolves around issues of consumption and overconsumption, but for some time I've also been doing research and writing about how people perceive the kind of environmental challenges before us and how different levels or kinds of perception then can lead to actions, both productive and unproductive. So you can learn more about me at my website. And if you like what you see, then shoot me a note. And if you don't, go have a beer and we'll talk later, right? Yeah. So I'd like to start by asking you, and I'll come back to this at the end very quickly. I want you just to take a second, and you can continue to do this while I'm talking. I want you to think about one of your favorite movies, or perhaps a book that you just go back to again and again and again. Or maybe there's a television series that for you generates sort of great affection. So just keep that in mind. And I'll come back to that in just a second to close, okay? So very quickly, in the 3 minutes I've got left, 3-4 minutes, I just want to go through some good news, some bad news, and some good news. The good news is that there are a lot of smart people sort of thinking about how we get the most bang for the buck in terms of reducing the warming load in the atmosphere that's driving sort of climate change. And to my money, probably the best thing that's come out in the last year, it just came out a couple months ago, is Paul Hawken's wonderful book called Drawdown. And so I commend it to you, but you don't have to buy the book in order to get a sense of what's going on. If you were to Google New York Times Drawdown, or if you were, I think if you were to do that, New York Times Drawdown, you'll find a little article that the New York Times had a few months ago that kind of takes you through a quiz that helps you sort of begin to understand what kinds of efforts actually give us the most payback for dealing with climate change. And so the good news is that there are people thinking about this, they're identifying what we should be doing, and these are things that folks like you and me should become more aware of, I think, so that we can put pressure on policymakers or think of other ways in which to drive the changes that are necessary. If you were to go to this Drawdown piece or look at the book later, you would see that most of the things that make a difference are not, they're not actions that are amenable to individual choice, buying something at the checkout counter. It has to do with more policy or structural kind of change. And I'm tempted to tell you what the top 2 or 3 things are, but then you won't have the thrill of trying to get what those are when you go to New York Times Drawdown in Google. So take a look at that, and you're off to the races. So I think that's good news. There are critical steps that can be taken. The bad news is that despite the kind of steps we can take, and now I'm going to kind of go into sort of bad sayings. The train has left the station. The cat is out of the bag. The horse is out of the barn. We have missed the window where any kind of action at this point can avoid what many natural scientists would tell us could be a catastrophic sort of warming of the atmosphere. I mean, if we stop emitting CO2 now, we go to full renewable energy tomorrow with no fossil fuels, we're looking at a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius sort of increase in global average temperature in the next 50 years. And if we continue on sort of a aggressive path of renewable energy, we're probably looking at a 3 to 4 degree increase in temperature in the next 50 to 75 years. And that has grave implications for farming, for weather patterns, for habitable areas, for biodiversity. So that train has left the station. Now, it is true that we should probably be doing what we can so that we sort of keep a bad situation from growing worse. But the bad news is that the situation is bad, and it's going to get worse. And it's going to get worse in part because the planet is now responding to warming by releasing stocks of climate warming gases, principally CO2 and methane, into the atmosphere that were stored in the planet before. So a little bit of this warming event we're in the midst of now is actually causing the planet to respond by getting even warmer by releasing carbon from the oceans, methane from melting tundra, and sort of the list sort of goes on. Scientists knew that those sort of thresholds and tipping points existed, and there was debate about where they lay, and we know now. It's happening. And some of the most, I think, pivotal scientific work in the last 6 months has been documenting this acceleration of accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, despite human efforts to reduce our anthropogenic sort of emissions. And so to close, at least for now, I promised you some good news on the back of bad news, so I'll do the good news again. I don't know about you, but as I think about my favorite movie or book or television series, it's usually about some flawed character who is ignoring the bell for another 30 seconds, some flawed character who has endured tragedy and is perhaps actually in the dumps, but then finds a way to come back, to use that tragedy to discover what it is to be fully human. And so for me, the greenhouse crisis in front of us is inevitably a crisis of tragedy. But the good news that may come from it is that if we can take steps now to ensure that in the face of tragedy, we will sort of respond in the way that our heroes or heroines in movies or books respond to tragedy, which is to get bummed out, get grumpy, but then somehow discover something that is innately and positively and wonderfully human in us, and then move forward in the face of that tragedy. That would not be a bad thing in my book. But that's the task before us now. It's not somehow stopping warming at a level that won't generate a world of hurt.
Climate change isn't just a story about the environment. It's a story about lives devastated by our changing planet. What I see frightens me. Is there a future for my children? As a journalist, I want answers. I'm going on a quest to confront the impact of climate change on us. I want to learn how we can tackle it before it's too late.
Every person, every nation, every small country, big country, do their little part. It adds up.
I hope that doesn't count towards my 5 minutes. But everyone, hi, I'm Jessica Cheam. I'm the managing editor of Eco-Business. I hope that this short clip has kind of piqued your curiosity. It's a documentary that I shot with Channel News Asia a few months ago. It was aired. And really it was a journey that I took to Malaysia and to India to see the devastation of climate change on communities today, not in the future, but today. But also looking at the solutions and the positive responses from countries like Denmark and from Singapore, where this is home, and how humanity is really responding to this crisis. And I was really encouraged today, thanks George and James Cook University for inviting me here to be part of this panel. I was really encouraged to see that climate change was being framed positively. We're talking about positive responses, and I think that it's really important because I've covered this topic for a decade now, and I must say that it can be very depressing. So I was at the Straits Times covering climate change for many years, and you can see all the doom and gloom stories, and I know the media has a big part to play because it's about dying polar bears and an apocalyptic future, and really it's not very cheerful news. But we also mustn't diminish the seriousness of the issue. There are some truths that we have to tell and some science regard to how our ecosystems are changing, and I think Shawn and Michael, you've brought us through quite a lot of those trends that we're seeing, and the world is finally waking up to this existential crisis like never before. So this then begs the question, what are we going to do about it? And I think I have a few observations here. And I think that the power of positive stories really is where we are going to see this force for change. And I will just use an example. Because climate change is being talked about by mainstream press and on the global stage by ministers and at political meetings, we're finally seeing a debate about it. And we're seeing a re-evaluation of our political and our economic systems and our social systems like we've never seen before. And at its heart, climate change really is a failure. It's a market failure. And when we think about capitalism, we think about how it's lifted billions of people out of poverty, but really it did so without pricing externalities. And now we're having a conversation about whether GDP is really the right measure of economic growth. And we're actually thinking about how do we redefine what it means to be prosperous. So we're seeing to see the response, and in my coverage, you know, at Eco-Business and at the various media publications that I work with, we're starting to see that we're coming up with new concepts like moral capitalism. We are thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals now that's going to define how we develop in the next 15 years. And we're starting to ask ourselves, why aren't we pricing externalities into the cost of our energy and also into the cost of our products and services? You see new concepts like natural capital emerging, and that is really putting a value on nature, on the soil and the water and the air that we breathe, and how businesses and governments have to put a price on these things that are around us before we would truly value it. And I think that that conversation is starting to happen. But we can all talk ourselves to death here if the finance industry isn't involved. And that was the next point I was going to make. We can sit here and talk all day, but if the finance industry isn't putting the money into where the projects need to be, and we're talking about renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects, low carbon technologies, then we're really not going to go anywhere. But we're seeing a change, and we're seeing something called sustainable finance start to dominate the conversations. I just came from a conference yesterday at the Singapore Institute of Directors Conference, and there were 1,000 people talking about sustainability and how do you get investors, the board of directors, to really look at what businesses are investing in, and how do you get the banks and the finance institutions to only agree to back the companies that are doing the right things. I think that's the question that we're seeing, and it's going to be even more important. So the other observation that I like to make in terms of positive response is the engagement of youth. I think the youth are really important. I mean, we're talking about the future here, and I probably won't be here in 50 years, but my children will be. And really, they are a powerful force yet to be mobilized. And they have a huge stake, obviously. Climate change threatens the prosperity and the economic viability of these youth in developing countries where 80% of youth live today. So I think there's a huge positive story in engaging the youth, and I've seen in my work how they really respond to environmental issues, to issues of responsibility, of transparency, of accountability, and I think that that is going to continue. So to just close my remarks, I'd like to say that if we are all going to do something about it, then we have to care, right? And how do we do that? I believe the key really is in the power of education. And it's really apt that we're here in this university. I think everything starts with knowledge. You need to have a thirst to find out the things around you. You need to have a thirst for knowledge. And only then you understand what the problems are. And only then you know what we can do as a solution. And that's where change will happen. So thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to thank for inviting me. My name is Sandeep Chamling Rai. I work for WWF as a senior advisor for global adaptation policy work. So my primary area of focus is more on the international policy process. Well, I have been doing this for last, I think, 14 to 15 years or so. On the topic of positive response to climate change, looking from the international process, I see few things that has been a really good move from the time when I started on the climate negotiation process in early 2003. So I will cover the 4 different positive things what I see over my experience so far. Firstly, let's talk about the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is also one of the big, I would say, positive move in the whole climate debate. The beauty of Paris Agreement is that it doesn't really had I would say a deadline or the ending date, because the Paris Agreement talks about temperature target. The primary goal of the Paris Agreement is to stabilize the global temperature well below 2 degrees and to hit towards 1.5. If you look at this graph I have taken out from the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It talks about if we do our business as usual or work, like Prof said, we are heading more than towards 5 degree temperature target in year 2100. But if you really do a high mitigation target, or if you do a lot of mitigation work right now, we will head towards close to 2 degree temperature target. So this basically shows that we need to really do a lot. And today we are already at 1.1 above pre-industrial state. So we have a very close narrow gap that we need to fulfill. And like Prof said, I think the trend has already moved in terms of now what kind of future that we would really want is the issue. What kind of temperature target that we want to see is the issue. Because next year, by September 2018, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is coming out with a new report that highlights the possibility of 1.5 and what are the various implications. And already the pre-review has gone so far. I had already reviewed one, but the scenario is not really good. So we need to understand that as well from the scientific point of view. So in summary, the Paris Agreement is one of the big achievements so far, or I would say positive move, though there is some hiccup by the by the Trump administration, who wants to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. They have not legally withdrawn yet. They will be legally out of the Paris Agreement if they want to move forward. Will be on 4th of November 2020 only. And so they are still in, but there is an intention to move out. The second positive thing what I see is the whole dimension when we look from the Kyoto Protocol, which is very top-down agreement, and the Paris Agreement is very bottom-up, or I would say mix of bottom-up as well top-down. And this is a very positive point, because every country has a role to play, every big and small, including Singapore, has a role to play in terms of how much they can contribute towards the UNFCCC process. And before the Paris Agreement came in, was agreed in 2015, every country was asked to put forward their nationally determined contribution, or NDCs. Before you say INDCs, now it's called NDCs, where country will say we will do this much. It's not just on what different criteria, but it's basically country putting forward. So if I go to the next slide, in this graph, I just want to show what's the scenario would looks like if there is no INDCs, and if all the INDCs will put forward in the place, what the scenario would be. Still it's narrowing down, but we are not really meeting the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5. So there is a big gap. And how the big gap needs to be addressed, I think the process, this COP, which is taking place in November in Bonn, is really crucial to identify what are the modalities for the facilitative dialogue, how to increase the INDCs. So my third point is that apart from all this scenario, like what the previous colleague has also said, there is various non-state actors who are really coming forward and playing a big role in climate debate. When I say non-state actors are everybody except the government part. So like the private sector, the university, the youth, the business industry, they are really coming forward and really playing a strong role in this space. Just to give you an example, after the Trump administration put forward their intention to withdraw, there was also a campaign, what we call We Are Still In, where more than 200 big government, industry and others really came down. That includes more than 120 million American, as well as $6 trillion investment in that particular space. So these are non-state actors who are really moving forward, and there are many other things upon that. So let me stop there, and I will come later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahim. And you won't be surprised to hear that what I think is the best positive response to climate change is to change our diets. And you all know that the great food that you ate before this event, all plant-based. So it's very easy. It's delicious. We can do it. So there are two overlapping reasons why reducing meat is a way to reduce climate change. First, eating meat is wasting food. We hear a lot about food waste in Singapore. Well, the number one way to reduce our food waste is not to eat meat, as I'll explain later. And meat worsens global warming. So let's look at these. First reason, eating meat is wasting food. We have to feed so many kgs of plant food to the animals to get just 1 kg of meat. And let me illustrate this with humans, human children. So the time that we gain the most weight, that children gain the most weight, is for girls about age 12 and for boys about age 13. They gain about 5 kgs in that 1 year. Well, think please, when you were 12 or 13, in that 1 year, how many kgs of food did you eat? How about just in 1 day? Just take 15 seconds, think. How many kgs of food did you eat every day when you were 12 or 13? Well, let's take a very conservative estimate. Let's say we eat only 1/7 of a kg per day. That comes out to 1 kg a week, 52 kgs in a year, to gain just 5 kgs. So you see all the waste. We've eaten 52, but we only gained 5. And it's the same thing with the cows, the pigs, and the chickens. So that's why so much of all the food that we grow has to be fed to the animals. And the result is all these environmental problems, particularly deforestation, because we have to cut down so many forests, like Shawn showed us. The forests are disappearing to grow food for animals or to other bad things like palm oil. So this leads us to the second reason why reducing meat is reducing climate change. Because when we have fewer trees, we have less CO2 soaked up. And Michael was already telling us so much CO2 or CO2 equivalents are being released now. The UN estimates that 18% of all the human-produced greenhouse gases come from animal agriculture. And this isn't news. Way back in 2006, the FAO had a report that said that animal agriculture produces more CO2 equivalents than all the cars, trains, planes, buses. So that's why we need to move away to help the environment. But there's other good reasons. Like Michael was saying, we can become better people. If we change our diets, we protect our health, and we show kindness to our fellow animals. So a plant-based diet is a healthier diet, and it's a lot kinder diet. So I'm going to end with a video instead of starting with a video. Mahim?
That's a smart move.
It's talking about the UK, but what this says is relevant around the world. Cut.
Dr. George.
So I wanted to ask Shawn, because Jessica was talking about positive stories, and I know the project that Nature Society is doing on Sumatra. You showed a picture of it. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure, thank you, George. I think you're referring to something called the Harapan project. So interestingly, of course, there are all of these logging concessions around the world, and Sumatra is no different. And an NGO called Burung Indonesia, which is part of a broader network of NGOs called BirdLife International, was actually able to lease logging concession to turn it into a forest restoration project. This forest still has tigers, elephants, and over 400 species of birds, and they actually managed to change Indonesian law. They actually had to have the law rewritten to not log a logging concession, but rather to reforest it. But I think what's happened is this reforestation concession has gained some traction, so it's not restricted to just this Burung Indonesia effort, but has been taken up by
other NGOs and in other islands too. So it's actually, I think that's quite a positive outcome. Thank you, George, for bringing that up.
I think I have a two-part question for George. The first part is, George, did you know about this book?
You told me about it.
I brought you this as a copy to thank you for putting this all together. Thank you so much. And you'll be happy to know that the third and fourth most effective actions, well, I want to qualify actions in a moment, in the book, and I'm ruining it for you if you go to the quiz. You're going to get one of these quiz answers completely right at New York Times Drawdown if you Google it. Number 3 is reducing food waste, and number 4 is a plant-rich diet. So my first question is, do you have the book? And no, so thank you so much for pulling all of this together. My second question is, as you open the book, as you read the book, you'll see that like with so many of these efforts, the authors argue that while individual action is important, we should eat less meat as individuals, that the danger of focusing primarily on individual action is that it becomes kind of a politics of guilt and of shaming. And that only works for the Catholic Church, because they have heaven and hell going for them. Now, the authors don't say that, actually, but instead, the real sort of power in getting us to a plant-rich, low food waste diet is to change kind of larger structural imperative subsidies for meat. So there's sort of a plea in there that while it identifies less meat and less food waste, there's a plea there for us to exercise more of our citizen muscle when thinking about this than our consumer muscle. And I'm wondering what you think about that argument.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great argument. So I think we have to do both, because the government thinks in Singapore people won't eat plant-based food, that they won't eat brown rice. You heard in the Prime Minister's National Day rally speech. Even the other ministers won't eat brown rice. So how are they gonna give up meat? So by doing this ourselves, we're showing that people can change. But yes, we want the subsidies. I think that's a great idea. Instead of taxing meat or other unhealthy foods, other unenvironmental foods, we should subsidize the green foods. And Vegetarian Society has a position paper. We sent it to the government. We're encouraging other people to sign it, other organizations, to try to change our diets to make them healthier and greener. Thank you.
I'd just like to respond to what you said about individual action, and I think that you're right. On the system level change, we need governments and businesses to really put in place things to change the way that we do things, infrastructure-wise, and what energy we're using. These are huge things that the individual citizen can't really change. But on the other hand, I think that as individuals, we need to vote wisely. And when I say vote wisely, I mean we need to vote the right governments in. In Singapore, maybe not so much of a choice, but I won't go there. But you need to vote the right governments in, the governments that will make the right decisions and the right policies. And then you need to vote with your dollar. You need to be supporting the businesses and the institutions that are actually investing in the right responses to climate change. So for example, I spoke about the banking industry. When you bank, who do you bank with? Do you bank with a responsible bank, or do you bank with someone that funds deforestation that leads to climate change? So I think the individual action is really important. And actually a question for you, Michael. You mentioned earlier that you do a lot of work in consumption and overconsumption, and that is a huge driver of climate change if you think about the emissions that we're having. So, what are your thoughts then? How do people respond to that?
Well, why don't I answer the last part of that question by going to the first part of your. I would want to say, first of all, that it's really important for us to do as many of these individual actions as possible. And even though I'm making the argument that we essentially live in a world of tragedy that's going to get worse, and that we should therefore look to see how we can make tragedy transformational, in the same way that it made it transformational for my favorite character in my favorite movie, Rick, in Casablanca, right? That doesn't mean that we still wouldn't want to try to do what we can. But I think there's 15 or 20 years of good scholarship to suggest that while individual actions are important, they really amount to very little in all of this. And this is one of the most sort of surprising and sometimes heretical things that comes out of my mouth from the perspective of some of you all. I think it's critically important that if you meet a little old lady on the corner, you should walk her across the street, because that's the right thing to do. It's good for you, it's good for her, it builds community. But don't think that's going to solve the pension crisis if you're doing it in the UK, or the Provident Fund issue if you're doing it here. So what I see principally in the overconsumption issue is that so much of the consumption issue has been characterized as you and I need to consume sort of better. And I think that's important from a mindful living standpoint. But where a lot of evidence, and some of my work is, why are we not as animated about climate change as we might be? Because what seems to be happening here for many of us is that there's a kind of a politics of guilt. There's a shaming. It's why environmentalists are never invited to parties. They're always going to be critiquing, what you're serving, and this is not how we build a social movement. And so the real issues come, I think, in behaving individually as a daily reminder of what we need to be doing collectively, to make it easy for us at the end of the day to do the right thing without thinking, rather than always have to be swimming kind of upstream and being hyper diligent.
I have a question for all of you. In the communities that you work with students, business, amongst fellow NGOs, in food, how close do you think we are to gaining this kind of that critical mass of that we need to kind of get over some of these problems that we face?
I've already spoken. I'll say really quickly and move on. I think in the US we have the critical mass now, but it's like, is it glass half full or half empty? So about 15% of people in the US, after 35 years of hyper-focused environmental education and a ton of kind of public outreach, about 15% of people recycle and consume green diligently. And I don't think we're ever going to get more than 15%, because the whole system is sort of geared to push you in another direction. Now, many people will look at that 15% and say, oh my God, 15%, those Americans don't care, they're awful, they're over-consumers. But if you have a history in sort of social change or organizing, you would kill for 15%. I mean, I don't mean literally kill, but Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, had fewer than 15% when the time was really important. But the concern I would bring to you is that we're spending too much time agonizing if it should be paper or plastic at the checkout counter. We're kind of wagging our finger at each other around individual consumption choices, as important as they are, without kind of thinking collectively about how we change structures so that the best part of our nature can come out consistently. So I think we already have it. I just think we're sort of focusing on the wrong things, and I think we are in part because there's money to be made in selling us green products and making us feel guilty that we're not using them.
I'll sit in my go. I don't know if you'll hear the truth or not, but for me, I think it's all too late. We're all going to end terribly, but I can't say that publicly.
Give me a hug, okay?
No, I mean, in all seriousness, in the business community that I work, I've seen huge change, and I have to be positive. I have to be positive. Otherwise, I wouldn't be running my business and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't think that whatever we were going to change or effect was going to work. And the point is that you never keep giving up, right? You never stop trying.
You never know, right?
That's right, and I think that's really important when we think about response to climate change. Is that yes, maybe we are too late, but we can't sit and do nothing, and therefore we have to respond.
I think you're right.
Well, just to add on debate in the whole circle, or from where I first started, I think the climate movement is really there, quite huge, but to the level of that is really needed is not that much, because what we see. Whatever we do, even if today we stop pumping the fossil fuel and go 100% renewables, still we will head beyond 1.5 degree temperature target. And this is a bitter truth, but that is what science is really telling. And today at 1.5, we are seeing a lot of impact. This month only what we have seen in all these hurricanes and others. So in 1.5, it will definitely go beyond that. But there is also optimistic, I would say, curve where we say we will exceed 1.5, but if we really do right work, we will come back to 1.5, but it takes centuries to do that. So that's I would say seriousness of this particular issue, but we don't see that, and sometimes I feel myself that this particular our generation who was really bogged down with the economy term, we will not be able to really change this. And what Melissa talked about the youth, I think they come with a different view, and they are the most, I would say, impacted people or impacted generation that they will face from the climate change compared to us. So I think they may do something rather than my generation or our generation to be safe, because we may not feel that particular impact that what is coming towards us. But in the meantime, just to put some positive note is that in whatever form that we want, but we have to somehow accept the terminology of geoengineering, and where the university and the universities and the research institute has a big role to play in terms of not pushing that are devastation to the ecosystem or the environment, because now with geoengineering in some form or others will definitely have a negative impact on ecosystem or wildlife, but there may be some way where we can do much more particular work on that part. But in terms of the seriousness and the depth of the issue, I think we are not there so far. So we need more action in all fronts.
Yeah, like vegetarianism is growing in some countries, but overall, meat consumption around the world is going up.
Yeah.
So I agree with Jessica. It's too late. We're doomed. But we might as well try, because you never know. Maybe someone's going to invent a machine that sucks up CO2 and CO2 equivalents. You never know. So let's do our best while we're still here, and who knows, a miracle could happen. But and then after that, I know that the audience has a lot of questions. Yeah. So,
but I might have started this sort of doom and tragedy thing, and I just want to be clear that I think tragedy can be a great thing. But
you're still alive.
But yeah. But you know, it calls out potentially the best in us. But I think if we continue to focus on how we're going to sort of solve the problem and make it all go away, then we perhaps miss, in addition to thinking about how we're going to make the problem less pernicious, we miss thinking about how we begin to create communities and social structures, how we engage journalists and financiers and educators and NGOs into preparing us to meet the tragedy with a kind of dignity and generosity and compassion that we know all too often doesn't come out of us when times get rough.
All right, so the question with the most number of votes. Everybody knows about global warming. Only a few really care. How to push the mass to change?
By having events like these.
Anything more to suggest?
Yeah, I'll be very short. We don't need the masses to change. I think this is one of the great Achilles heels of the movement. Civil rights, women's suffrage, independence never happened with the masses changing. You know, most of us are just, 80% of us are just thinking 80% of the time about how to get through the day, including many of you probably sitting there right now wondering, I thought this was supposed to be a hopeful sort of panel, right? You know, things change when we identify small minorities of like-minded people, and we're smart and we're strategic. And I think this is one of the great Achilles heels of the climate movement, is we've been drawn into this narrative that we have to get everybody to change. We've confused our theology about bringing everybody to the planet of Gaia, to the religion of Gaia, to the hard-nosed strategy that people that we admired as organizers knew before, which is small groups of people mobilized in strategic ways can shift the structure, and then the rest of us kind of follow along.
Just to add to that, I think the only people that need to change are the financiers. So what we all should do is write to your bank tomorrow and ask them what they're doing. Do we have financiers here?
Just to respond on this part, what I always say is that what kind of future that you want to give to your future generation? That would be a really good question posing to those individuals who really don't want to care. In terms of what kind of future that you want to give to your future generation might help in terms of thinking on that particular line and changing their behaviors. Just a different dimension.
All right, thank you. So our next question is, how do you convey the message that climate change is real, given that some people do not feel the effects of this issue? How do you convey the message that climate change is real, given that some people do not feel the effects of this issue?
Thank you. I think people react differently to different messages, and so maybe for certain audiences, a discussion like this is the perfect place to come away with the motivation to do something. In a way, maybe academics or scientists, like many of us, we can do research. But how does that translate to a compelling message? And so maybe there should be other people also trying to highlight these activities. And maybe the other thing is, I feel maybe sometimes we don't link issues so well. I mean, and this is what, in conservation, certainly we're kind of guilty of that. We go on and on about wildlife, but maybe don't necessarily link it with human health, the resource use, and things like that. So I think treating these issues holistically, and maybe occasionally celebrating them to show how wonderful they are and how they're worth saving. And that we can do that. We still have enough time to do that.
I was going to say that your head must really be in the sand if you don't feel the effects of climate change. I mean, just the past 2 weeks we've seen Typhoon Hato and then Hurricane Irma and Harvey, causing huge devastation. And the documentary that I showed you at the start, if any of you are interested in watching it, you can Google Channel News Asia confronting climate change. You see the communities that interviewed in India, they've lost their homes that their father has built, and these are people who lost their homes years ago. And we don't see them, not in Singapore, but they do exist. And really, this is why I talked about education. It's so important that if you care about the people around you, you care about your country and the world that we live in, it is your responsibility to educate yourself. And I don't see how anybody can not want to care or not feel the effects.
That's really good, thank you.
To pick up on the point that Shawn mentioned, there's this term I learned just last year, intersectionality. That means that we try to link different movements. So we heard about all these storms, like in the United States, and maybe a handful of people died. But thousands of people died in Bangladesh. And where was the coverage of that? Where was that on the front page? Was that given so much appreciation? And certainly the same thing with climate, with like the ocean taking over New York City. Well, is Donald Trump going to die? Is he going to lose his home? Well, he's got 5 or 6 others. So so we have to link when we talk about the environment, we have to link it to so many other causes. Just like with the meat industry. It's the poor people who don't have much food choice. It's the poor people who live near the slaughterhouses and the factory farms who get all the pollution from them. So I think what Shawn said about the intersectionality is a really good idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm that. I also just wanted to backtrack. The person who asked how do we get everybody on board, I certainly didn't mean in my enthusiasm to sort of shout that question down. I was trying to be hopeful and sort of affirming. And then in terms of making people aware of climate change, I used to do a lot of work in India, and I still sort of stay in touch with colleagues there. Go back to some of the old villages that I worked in long ago, and it seems to me that there's probably 3 billion people on the planet who are acutely aware of the impact of climate change. I mean, it's a big number. That's a cause for hope. The issue is that they tend to be among the more powerless in our global community. So I just find myself wondering, in part because of questions that students have raised with me, that if I come to this issue, like many of you perhaps, thinking, well, how do I get more people to be aware, that we might get more kind of bang for our buck. You know, we only got so much time and energy on this planet. If instead of trying to convince people who perhaps for whatever reason aren't seeing it in front of them, that we think about how do we contribute to helping to empower and mobilize those who have every incentive to work hard to make changes. So that becomes then more of an issue about getting engaged in global justice movements as opposed to trying to convince your neighbor next door that climate change is a reality. This might be a more fruitful avenue, and at the end of the day, perhaps a more fulfilling one.
All right, thank you. So, audience, at this point, I would like to ask you whether you are ready to go ahead with more questions. Just 2 questions answered. Are you ready for more? Yes? Are you enjoying this discussion and interaction with our panelists? All right, so we're good to go. All right, just need to be in the loop.
You're very good at this. We need to hire you for Yale-NUS events.
I'm ready. Anyway, so next question. Why do you think Singapore has not implemented a no plastic bag policy in its supermarkets? For example, in India, where the whole of India's plastic bags are banned, straws are banned, and anything made out of plastic is banned. So why has Singapore not implemented this rule? Ladies and gentlemen?
I know the answer.
I know the answer too. You go first though. and then I'll copy your answer. Okay.
I know this answer because I recently hosted an environment forum with the Environment Minister, Mr. Masagos. And the reason why they're not willing to do so is that they feel that the plastic bag waste issue is dealt with adequately in Singapore. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they feel that plastic bags have its use because in HDB homes and in high-rises we bag our refuse in plastic bags. And then these plastic bags actually feed our incinerators and they have a high calorific value. And therefore incinerators burn more efficiently because there are plastic bags in it. And because of that, it gets converted to, waste gets converted to energy. So they actually get energy from our waste with our incinerators. And therefore he said also that there is a political price to pay. The aunties and uncles will stop voting for PAB. So I think overall, taken into consideration, it's not a fight that they're willing to take. Having said that, though, we are seeing a huge civic movement on plastic bags, and I think that the government would be silly to think that they can just, ignore the issue. I think it's going to come back, and there has to be some sort of response to it at some point.
If you're interested in this issue, just shoot me an email because I actually teach a unit of this on kind of policy making at Yale-NUS. It's a fascinating case because the whole plastic bag issue actually is one of these instances where it started in the global south. It started in Bangladesh and in India. In Bangladesh, in Dhaka in particular, plastic bags were plugging up sewers. And in northern India, cows were eating the plastic bags, and they were, so there was a real kind of material imperative. And then it's a great study in how a kind of a norm that starts out in just one place, which seems pretty small. And so this is my ray of sunshine here, that if the right conditions are in place, that norm can spread, and it did. It moved to Ireland that had what was described at one point as the EU's most popular tax on plastic bags, then to the rest of Northern Europe, and then through more than 150 cities in the United States, despite the real effort by the plastic bag industry to sort of squelch it. So it's a real interesting case in how small efforts in one place driven by material considerations can really drive change elsewhere if the right conditions are in place. And I think, again, that's where the citizen muscle, coming together with other people to try to figure out where are those small little tipping points as citizens that can lead to big changes. To my way of thinking, again, you know my rap by now, that's a far more promising way for us to be thinking about things than to stand paralyzed at the checkout counter wondering if we're going to go to hell for buying a bad product.
Thank you. So, our next question, inspirational talk by George. Apart from him, the rest of the panelists, this question goes out to you. Apart from George, are the rest of the panel speakers vegan or vegetarians? If no, why not? Since it's kind to the environment and animals. Dr. Lam.
You had to pick me first. So no, I'm not. No, I'm not vegetarian. I eat animal protein a few times a week. Some dinners. My wife is vegetarian, and I think I'm gonna. There's pressure to follow suit. But yeah, no, I am acutely aware. But I think one of the things that George, when we talk, it's not just about vegetarian or not. I mean that or vegan. That would be the ultimate, of course. But even just cutting out 1 or 2 meals makes a big difference, and in large part due to George. I don't eat meat for lunch or for breakfast, and maybe a few dinners. So it's not perfect by any means.
I have 2 daughters from a previous marriage, and I went off and had a little boy 4 months ago at my age, engaging in geriatric parenting. So that's a bad thing from the environment standpoint. I like to say definitely about fixing carbon in terms of a small child, but that's probably not going to work. So in addition to having a small child, Elliot, 4.5 months now, he's wonderful. I'm not getting any sleep. I also occasionally eat meat. Yeah. But I think I would want to highlight those kinds of questions which come up always in an environmental conversation. As a sort of whole question of hypocrisy, right? Are we kind of walking our talk? And I think what I want to gently sort of suggest to all of us is that it is impossible not to be hypocritical with respect to the environment, given the structures within which we live. So I do think we need to call each other on these kinds of individual sort of actions. But the moment that becomes immobilizing, a little shame-filled, I think we're playing into the hands of those who would want to maintain business as usual. I think it's about joyfully coming together, accepting our faults, recognizing there's no way to be pure, having grown up in an industrial society, and finding ways to change the system so that when I go to McDonald's, which I actually don't do anymore, but if one were to go to McDonald's, how is it that a salad is more expensive than a quarter pounder, right? I mean, that's telling you there's something fundamentally wrong, and it has to do with subsidies and taxes and the power of the meat industry. And until we sort of figure out ways to attack it at that level, while also, of course, not going to McDonald's, but, you know, it's these, yeah. So I eat meat occasionally. I have a small child. I have 2 cats. They eat meat all the time. In the small cans, right? Yeah.
Why stop at vegetarianism? We should all stop having children.
Yeah, I know.
We want to save the world. No, I'm not vegetarian, although I did try it for a few years before I got married. And then I got pregnant, and then my mom kind of said, you can't be pregnant and vegetarian. That's going to be terrible for the child, and she made me feel really guilty about it. So then I started eating meat again. And then I had another child. So, you know, it's been a few years. I mean, my youngest is 3 years old, so. But I do try. Yeah, no, I do try as much as possible to be vegetarian. And I think the people that surround us play a huge part. You know, I used to cook vegetarian meals at home, and none of my family would eat it. And then I ended up having to waste the food. So, do you want to waste the food, or you want to cook something to eat? I mean, it's really, really difficult. But I believe, like you, that really firmly we need to call each other out on it and really kind of make the concerted decision and tackle things really at the systems level. Why is a salad price more?
It's
than
crazy.
burger?
I mean, God,
I think that's
think what has to happen in order to make that happen, right?
Well, I'm vegetarian, but
you are?
Yeah. But nothing to do with climate change.
So it doesn't really count.
No. What I'm saying is, I'm the 3rd generation in my family to be vegetarian, and coming from my ethnic group back in my country, Nepal, we are like carnivores because our history or my father and grandfather are from Gurkha. I don't know whether you guys know or not. So we are from good cause family, and we are known to be like a carnivorous and heavy drunker. But having said that,
That's vegetarian.
But having said that, yeah, my grandfather was first time he turned vegetarian because due to my grandmother, and my father became vegetarian, so do I. So I'm vegetarian by birth, but it's really hard to survive as a vegetarian. Whenever you travel, you really struggle. And I always thank our Italian food because they have some vegetarian options, but others, I had a very bad time when I was traveling to Latin American country. I was eating just French fry for a couple of days. Over here, even in Singapore too, if you go to Harbor Center and ask for vegetarian food, you have to pay $1 extra because they have to clean their plates and those kind of things. So it is tough, but it's not due to choice because of my family legacy. I am vegetarian since birth.
Actually, it's a kind of continuum, and there's no one who's perfect. Like, you know, like the $5 notes, they use pork to make them in Singapore, in the UK, other countries. So it's basically impossible to be pure. But so we just do what we can. For example, at Michael's University, Yale in US, I think 3 days a week, one canteen is devoted to plant-based food.
It's taken off much more than we had expected it might, yeah.
So, yeah, like Michael said, we shouldn't guilt trip ourselves. We just do what works for us.
The next question is from Sapna. Is eco-business in Singapore successful? List some examples where an individual has a role to play, can earn a good income and become self-sufficient.
I don't think you'll ever be rich being an environmentalist. So that is my answer to your question. But in all seriousness, eco-business is successful. I have a team of 15 people now. It's not been an easy journey. When we first started, everybody was unpaid or paid very low salaries, and that was, to a certain extent, a reflection of sustainability being quite a fringe issue, climate change being ignored by the media. But we are now a successful operation, and we have offices in Sydney, Manila. We're opening one in KL and Hong Kong very soon. And I mean, when I say open office, it's just one person. But it's a start. And what we are hoping to do is really to dedicate ourselves to purposeful journalism. You know, sustainable development issues are really important, and we want to do what eco-business is doing in Singapore, everywhere else. So when you ask me are there successful examples, yes, and there are many, many businesses who have managed to turn a profit while adding to society, creating social value, and doing the right thing. So it's really a matter of choosing something that you want to do that you think is going to help make the world a better place instead of contributing to the problem. I think that's my answer to that.
So the next question is really interesting. Which has more impact on reducing the carbon footprint collectively, taking the public transport or becoming a vegetarian?
Well, George has the book.
Yes. Is that the answer?
The answer?
Yeah, Michael, do you know where it is in the book?
Yeah, no, there's a tables at the very end.
Oh.
It's a tricky question because if you're taking public transit, how much are you taking it? In other words, how much car avoidance is happening?
And what electricity source is it powered by?
But in general, changes in diet have a greater impact than local transportation. That shifts a bit if we're talking about a lot of flying. Changes in diet for reasons that George has called out can be huge. If you're kind of curious about what that might mean for you, if you go to the Global Footprint Network, you can take the ecological footprint quiz, and you can actually see how if you sort of change your choices with respect to diet or transportation, how that has sort of an impact, what kind of an impact that has on your overall sort of footprint. But in general, it's food. The bad news about doing the global footprint quiz is it's almost impossible to get your global footprint down to a sustainable level, which means it sort of highlights, and they speak to this, the limits of that sort of individual action. There's got to be some collective sort of work on that as well. So take public transit and eat a veggie burger while you're on the bus, but don't let the captain see you because you're not supposed to eat on the bus.
But if I could add, I mean, one thing which makes, I mean, for some people that like us, maybe we get quite excited by this, but I think it becomes overwhelming for many because then there are all these other confounding things, like where was the crop grown, how was it produced. Quinoa is an example of very wonderful, tasty grain, but now the people who grow it can't eat it because they've basically been priced out. They make much more exporting it, and so this disrupts some local communities. So I guess the point isn't really to worry about everything, but I think one of the things that we could benefit from here as consumers would be to know where things come from. I don't think we have that sort of that tradition yet, and I think it would be very useful, be enlightening, and I think it would really help people who want to make good choices.
So this question is from Tan Han Chong. NUS Yale students fail to have their school divest from fossil fuels. How can we foster a more conducive climate for fossil divestment?
I guess that's me.
Yes.
All right, so the Yale and US students, huh? Yeah. So, some of you know there's been a worldwide movement to try to divest university funds from companies do fossil fuel companies. Right? And so students at Yale and US have been pushing on this for about a year and a half. Our difficulty is that our endowment funds are entangled with NUS's endowment funds, and that's a big pot of money. But I actually think there's some movement occurring on that, so I'm gonna sort of not be completely hopeless on that. It's a politically charged issue in part because of Singapore government's investments in the fossil fuel industry as well. So there's a lot happening there that makes it perhaps more difficult for an organization like NUS to divest as compared to some of the big name kind of universities in the US or Europe. We're working on it, man. It's going to happen.
Thank you, Professor Maniates. And ladies and gentlemen, sorry.
But there are positive signs, like, Temasek, which is the investment arm of the Singapore government, invested, I think, $75 million in Impossible Foods, which is a company that makes burgers from plant foods. So there are some hopeful signs. Whether they invested the money because they want to help people reduce meat or because they think it's a great investment, will make a lot of money, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's a good thing that they did.
I mean, last thing, I mean, Jessica, of course, the expert on this, but if you think of, a lot of my students feel Singapore is such a small country, what difference can we make? It's so insignificant compared to not even China, say even some of our neighboring countries. But if you think of the resources that are here, the expertise, the transport industry, finance, and you think of the reach of all these and the impact that they can make, if this could be turned in a positive direction, boy, we really could do a lot of amazing things. So I am very hopeful. I am very hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think my plastic bag example a little bit ago, who thought that sort of, 25 activists in Dhaka were going to sort of spread a plastic bag sort of movement around the world, and things have a way of sort of taking off and shaping. I want to echo. I don't want to give you a false hope because really the science has really changed in the last 6 months. We put out about 8 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere every year, and until recently, half of that, 4 gigatons has been absorbed by the environment. And it looks like most of that 4 gigatons in the last year is no longer being absorbed. So just overnight, almost, potential doubling of annual concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's some tough news. But, it's kind of like we're living at the beginning of the agricultural revolution. We're kind of like, why is she planting this stuff in the ground? Or go back even further, when fire we're living at one of these pivotal moments in human existence. And I don't know if God or whatever your cosmology there is angry with us or just has a sense of humor, But the reality is that we have the privilege of being alive at one of these moments in human history, and it's going to be tough. And I don't think we should kid ourselves about that. But there are ways I think we can support one another to move sort of forward in remarkable ways. It's a privilege. At least let's call it that.
I won't be doing my job if I didn't ask all of you to sign up to the Eco-Business newsletter, because the stories that we publish actually answer a lot of the questions here. So I'd encourage for you guys to get engaged in the content. And if any of you want to email me after, my email address is on the website. Thank you.
It's free.
And yes, my content is free. It's all free.
And George wants to tell you that the number one measure to deal with climate change of the top 100 is changing air conditioner refrigerants to a different kind of chemical. Because refrigerants have a warming potential that are thousands of times greater than CO2, and we're actually beginning to make a move in that direction. But you can't make that change by going down to the courts and asking for something. You make that change by respectfully asking your MPs and other representatives in the Singapore government to put Singapore on the forefront of this movement rather than being a kind of aggressive follower.
And coming to our last question for the evening. This one's from Lynette. I think the world works in a balance, and surely there are negative implications of the world shifting to a plant-based diet. If so, what are they?
Well, I guess, there's negative effects of if everyone quits smoking, right? All the people who make money selling cigarettes, all the tax that the governments get from cigarette sales, all the farmers who grow tobacco, they have to grow something else. So yeah, everything has some negative effects, but overall, changing to a plant-based diet would be wonderful.
Just something about this, we were talking earlier about interconnectedness of issues, and sometimes yes, your diet has health implications, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. It turns out in many societies where people eat less meat, there's also less hunting, and wildlife can thrive even amidst really dense populations. So that's a direct thing. We are eating not just bushmeat, but we are eating species to extinction, magnificent species, bluefin tunas. These unagi eels, which are so popular, they're actually endangered. Yet there's still a huge industry, and they're miraculous. They what do? They swim. They're born in the sea. The little they call glass eels, and they swim up to these rivers. And until recently, people didn't even know where some of these things spawn. And in Europe, they go all the way up to the Sargasso Sea. In North America, these two different species meet in the Sargasso Sea, and then they make their way back to their respective coasts, thousands of kilometers away. They're just miracles of nature. And I think, I would like to see these miraculous things survive. So Jessica's children and Elliot and others will have that same chance. Again, if we know what we're saving, these are worth saving. We should do everything. I think we're duty bound to do everything that we can to leave these behind for others to marvel at in the same way we've had this privilege.
That's a nice ending. Thank you. Thanks.
And with that, we end the round of questions and answers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I must say that you guys really went all out to pose wonderful questions. Big round of applause to yourselves. A big round of applause for our wonderful panel.